Welcome to Quiz Time. I'm your Quizmaster, Sean, and I've got a lot of questions for you. Questions that are meant to test your memory, kind of clean out the cobwebs of what we learned in days past, see how well we are up on current events. And today we've got an advanced true and false challenge. So, we'll either remember stuff or we'll learn stuff. Either way, we're going to have a lot of fun doing it. Why not? All right, are you ready? Peter Bruegel, the Elder's painting, The Harvesters, is set during wintertime. Is that true or is it false? And that would be false. The practice of crop rotation was first developed in the Middle Ages, not ancient times. Is that true, or is that just plain silly? Crop rotation? Well, that's false. In literary studies, the term pathetic fallacy refers to the attribution of human emotions to inanimate objects or nature. Is that false or true? And that is true. The Renaissance technique of sfumato, meaning vanished like smoke, was pioneered by Raphael rather than Leonardo da Vinci. Is that true or false? And that is false. The Three Sisters agricultural technique refers to growing corn, beans, and potatoes together. Is that false? Or is it true? And that is false. The acerola cherry contains more vitamin C per weight than any other natural food source. Is that true? Or is that false? And that is true. The threshing floor in traditional agriculture was typically located underground to maintain cool temperatures. Is that true? Or is that false? That is false. Edouard Manet's Olympia caused controversy primarily because it depicted a self-aware prostitute directly gazing at viewers. Is that false? Or is it true? That is true. The term chiaroscuro in art refers to the technique of using bold, complementary colors to create visual contrast. True or false? That is false. In medieval European agriculture, fields were typically divided into three sections: one for winter crops, one for spring crops, and one left fallow. True or not true? That is true. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein worked as a rural schoolteacher in Austria after writing his first major philosophical work. Is that true or is that false? That is true. The use of contrapposto posing in sculpture originated in ancient Egypt. Is that true or is that false? That's false. Traditional hayricks were constructed with ventilation shafts to prevent spontaneous combustion. Is that false? Or is it true? It's true. The Columbian Exchange primarily involved the transfer of artistic techniques between Europe and the Americas. Is that true, or is that false? Transferring artistic techniques. And it's true. The practice of using ox-drawn plows significantly predates the use of horse-drawn plows in European agriculture. Is that true? Or is that a falsehood? That's true. The pigment mummy brown used by 19th century painters was actually made from ground-up Egyptian mummies. Ew! Is that false? Or is it true? Ugh. It's true. The Little Ice Age, roughly 1300 to 1850, had no significant impact on European agriculture. Is that true, or is that false? That is very false, if false can be very. The word clabber refers to a type of sour milk that naturally thickens and curdles, once commonly used in rural cooking. Is that true, or is that false? That is true. In literary analysis, the term pastoral specifically refers to works written by shepherds or farmers. Is that true? Or is that just plain silly? False. Well, of course, that's just silly. It's false. Slash and burn agriculture increases soil fertility in the short term, but typically leads to soil degradation over time. True or false? That's true. The technique of giornata in fresco painting involves dividing the work into sections that can be completed in a single day. Is that true, or is it false? That's true. Good organizing. The cultivation of tulips began in the Ottoman Empire before spreading to the Netherlands in the 16th century. True or false? And that is true. In most traditional rural communities, the harvest moon occurs in December. False or true? Well, that's false. The ancient Roman writer Columellus De Re Rustica is the oldest surviving complete agricultural treatise in Latin. It sounds true, but is it false? It's false, because it sounds true. The concept of the commons in medieval farming referred to land that could only be used by nobility. Is that true, or is that false? It sounds false. It's false. Henry David Thoreau's Walden experiment lasted for exactly 1 year. Is that true, or is that false? That is false. The technique of grafting fruit trees was unknown before the 18th century. Is that true, or is that false? And that is false. In traditional European rural communities, the position of the village blacksmith was typically hereditary. Is that true, or is that false? Dad was a blacksmith, so I'm a blacksmith. That's true. That's just how it worked back then. The enclosure movement in England primarily benefited small-scale farmers. Is that true? Or is that false? That's false. The term genre painting in art history refers specifically to paintings depicting religious scenes. Is it true? Or is it false? Yeah, that's false. The Haber-Bosch process, which revolutionized agriculture by enabling nitrogen fixation, was developed during World War I. True or false? I think it's Haber-Bosch. That's true. Traditional cob houses are made primarily from a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. Is that true or is that false? I mean, it sounds true. And it is true. It happens. The phrase, to separate the wheat from the chaff, originates from the ancient practice of winnowing. Is that true? Or is that false? Yeah, of course, that's true. The tradition of wassailing in orchards was primarily meant to drive away evil spirits that might harm fruit trees. Well, that does sound false, doesn't it? But maybe it's true. Ha! It's true. The Bayeux Tapestry is technically not a tapestry, but an embroidery. Is that true, or is that false? That is true. The ancient agricultural technique of terrace farming originated independently in both the Andes and Southeast Asia. Is it true? Or is it false? That's actually true. In traditional beekeeping, skeps were beehives made from straw that made honey harvesting impossible without destroying the hive. Is that true? Or is that false? That's true. Thatched roofs typically need to be completely replaced every 2 to 3 years. Is that true, or is that false? That's false. The practice of transhumance involves moving livestock from lowlands to highlands with the changing seasons. Is that true? Or is that false? That is true. Vincent van Gogh sold all but one of his paintings during his lifetime. Is that true? Or is that false? I mean, you want it to be true. But really, yeah, it's false. The construction of traditional dry stone walls requires no mortar or cement. Is that false? It sounds false. But could it be true? It's actually true. The term cottage industry originally referred specifically to textile production in rural homes. Is that true? Or is it false? It's true. The ancient Roman festival of Saturnalia prohibited agricultural work, but was unrelated to the agricultural cycle. Is that false? Or is it true? Yeah, that's false. The practice of hedge laying primarily served decorative purposes rather than practical ones. Is it true or is it false? That is false. The use of heavy horses in agriculture became less common, primarily due to soil compaction concerns rather than mechanization. Does that sound right? Or is that false? Yeah, it's false. Traditional corn dollies were made from the last sheaf of the harvest and kept until the following spring as a good luck symbol. Well, that sounds true. Is it? Or is it false? Corn dollies. That's true. The rule of thirds in artistic composition was first formally articulated during the Renaissance. Is that false? Or is that true? First formally articulated. That's false. It's been around a long time. The physiocrats were an 18th century group of economists who believed agriculture was the sole source of true wealth. Is that true or is that false? That's true. Traditional water meadows were deliberately flooded in winter to protect crops from frost damage. Is that true or is it false? That is false. The term glebland referred to land owned by the church that was typically worked by the parish priest himself. Is that true? Or is that false? That's true. The tradition of telling the bees involved informing a beehive of major events in the beekeeper's household, such as deaths or marriages. It sounds silly and false, but it also kind of sounds true. Because it is true. And kind of sweet. Caravaggio's revolutionary use of tenebrism influenced primarily Northern European painters, but few Italian ones. Is that true? Or is it not true? It is not true. The transition from the sickle to the scythe for harvesting grain improved efficiency by at least tenfold. Is that true? Or is that too good to be true? False. It's actually true. The ancient practice of silvopasture, combining trees with livestock grazing, decreased biodiversity compared to open pasture. Is that true? Or is that false? Yeah, that's false. Traditional village bread ovens in medieval Europe were typically private rather than communal. Is that true? Or is that false? Traditional village bread ovens were not private. They were communal. The agricultural revolution in 18th century Britain preceded the Industrial Revolution and helped make it possible. Is that true? Or is that false? That's true. The folk practice of beating the bounds involved physically striking parish boundary markers to preserve knowledge of property lines. Is that true? Or is that false? That is true. The medieval field system, known as infield-outfield, involved rotating crops between two equally managed fields. Boy, that sounds true. But might it be false? Yes, it's false. The first detailed writing on companion planting, growing beneficial plants together, comes from ancient Chinese agricultural texts. Is it false? Or is it true? That is true. In traditional Northern European households, the box bed or enclosed bed was primarily designed to showcase woodworking craftsmanship. True or false? And that is false. Thomas Hardy's Far from the Maddening Crowd features a scene where a shepherd loses his entire flock, a common occurrence in 19th century farming. That must be false. Or is it true? It's true. The drovers' roads of Britain were primarily used for transporting agricultural equipment, rather than livestock. Is it true? Or false? That's false. In Europe, harvesting grain with a sickle was traditionally considered women's work, while using a scythe was men's work. Is that true, or is that false? It's true. The technique of pollarding trees was developed primarily for aesthetic purposes in formal gardens. True or false? And that is false. The practice of using seaweed as fertilizer in coastal farming communities dates back to at least the 12th century. False or true? That's true. The design of the modern pitchfork has remained essentially unchanged since medieval times. Is that true? Or is it not? It's changed. It's false. The year without a summer, 1816, was caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora and led to widespread crop failures across the northern hemisphere. Is that true or is that false? That's true. The rural practice of mumming, or performing folk plays, traditionally occurred primarily during spring planting season. Is that true or is it false? That's false. Kind of busy during planting season. The use of oxen rather than horses for plowing in medieval Europe was primarily due to religious symbolism rather than practical considerations. Is that true or is it false? That's false. And question 70. Prior to the 18th century, most European farming knowledge was transmitted through written agricultural manuals rather than oral tradition. True or false? Going with false on that one. All right, you did an amazing job. Thanks for playing with us. Hey, don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and share your score in the comments, please. Hey, and while you're at it, check out these videos right here. They're a lot of fun to produce. They're a lot of fun to play with. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.